I'm your host, Ray Dogum, and welcome to VibeCast. VibeCast is Vibe Bio's weekly podcast where we explore some of the hottest topics in drug development and technology innovation. Join us to learn, imagine, question, and help us identify and develop solutions together. Our guest today is Andy Hall, co-founder of RareCan, which he co-founded to help rare cancer patients find clinical trials. Andy, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Well, thanks very much, and thanks very much for the invitation for taking part, Ray. It's a real privilege.
Absolutely. I'm really excited to talk to you again. And I'm looking forward to maybe first, if you wouldn't mind sharing your introduction to the audience so they get to know you a little bit better.
Hi, I'm Andy Hall. I originally trained as a clinical hematologist. That's somebody who looks after people with leukemias and other forms of blood diseases. And when I was a young doctor, I was really fascinated by the way in which the emerging field of molecular biology was beginning to explain diseases at a molecular level, and that really excited me. And so during my training, I decided to do a little bit of research, and I thought I'd do a 6-month period of research. And I never went back to see the patients because the research was so fascinating. So I then spent the rest of my time working in a laboratory and then later on in management.
What do you think it is between some people who would prefer or love to see patients versus people who are fascinated by the research of it? I feel like there's a type of person to get enthralled by the science or maybe the unknown, the uncertainty of it all in research.
Yeah, I really loved looking after the patients, and I still do enjoy meeting people affected by the rare cancers I'm particularly interested in. I like to think I wasn't the worst doctor in the world, but I just became dominated by a feeling that my better contribution would be to try and nibble away at some of the problems involved in curing serious diseases like cancer, rather than seeing patients routinely. I have every respect for somebody who spends that time. The other thing is that particularly if you're dealing with relatively young people, which is the case for blood cancer, it is emotionally quite draining. And I think at a young age, I was doubtful whether I could sustain a whole career of that emotional turmoil, to be honest. And again, I have immense respect for people who manage to do that, maintain their professionalism and their spirits during that quite arduous emotional time. So maybe I didn't feel I had that within me, if I'm candid.
Well, thanks for sharing that. I do appreciate that context. And I can't imagine, going into the clinic day to day, seeing these patients, most of them being very young patients, just kind of not knowing their future, like immediate future almost. So I think that's really noble of what you did and what you're doing now. Let's kind of dive into what RareCan is actually trying to do now. So RareCan, you started in 2020, and because of this passion to connect patients with clinical trials, oftentimes you mentioned in your biography that these patients are looking for something to help them, but there are no clinical trials. You're often unable to help them. But what is RareCan actually doing to enable them to find these trials?
Yeah, so when I was working in the lab, my area of interest was childhood cancer, which is mercifully very rare, really. And we used to find out really exciting and interesting things on 1 or 2 patients. But in the world of science, 1 or 2 is not enough. You always need a reasonable number to exclude the fact that it could be just pure chance what you're finding.
Right, so that was a certain power to
the statistical power. So I searched in vain for the bit of the textbook in stats which said if something's rare, don't worry about any of this. Unfortunately, that's not the case. So I was frustrated by that, and I met, at the other half of the equation, lots of people who were affected by these diseases who were keen to take part but were never asked. So I met people who said, no one ever asked me to take part in research. So I thought that there'd be a way to bring those two worlds together. Now, when you're working in a university, you have academic outputs you have to attend to, so you don't have time to do that sort of thing. Your whole raison d'etre is to produce new results. So I had to leave it until I left the university. And then I decided to set some system up whereby those two worlds could be brought together. The world of the patient wanting to take part in research and the world of the researcher wanting to find those patients. And so we set up RareCan as a company. We thought about doing it as a charity, but charities are hard pushed to meet the demands they've got for basic research or translational research, and they don't find it an easy sell to their sponsors, this sort of infrastructure. So we set it up as a private company. And we set up a portal where people with rare cancer can register their interest. They can put up their electronic hand and say, I'm the sort of person that could contribute to your science and research. And then we talk to groups, companies, commercial companies, non-commercial companies about accessing those patients. And that's our business model, to charge them access to that.
I got you. So patients are familiar and aware of RareCan. They become like associated with RareCan. And then through RareCan, researchers are able to filter out and look or find these patients effectively. Mm-hmm. How many patients are currently or have used RareCan or have been part of the RareCan membership community?
So we're an early stage startup, as you say. These things often have a slow take up. We've got 1,500 people in the UK at the moment, and they have a whole range of different rare cancers. We're looking forward to extending into other countries, including the US and Australia, because rare diseases are rare. You need to go across country boundaries. These diseases don't respect country boundaries. So, increasing the numbers is something we really need to do, both from a commercial point of view, to be honest, but also from a science point of view.
But even having 1,500, I think that's a significant number because, like you mentioned, these are rare cancers. It's not an easy population to necessarily find. So the fact that you have over 1,000 and growing is definitely a positive sign. And like you mentioned, I think the U.S. has many trials overall that can be made available potentially to your patients. So that definitely is a good, in my opinion, it's a good direction to head in. How does your experience as a physician influence your work now as the chief scientific officer at RareCan?
That's a very interesting question. So I have lots of colleagues I've worked with over the years who don't have a clinical background, and they're extremely bright. They know their subject, but they don't find it easy to put it in context always. So they will specialize in a particular area of biology, for example, or genetics, but they won't understand how that fits into a general picture of health. So if you've got that grounding in general medicine, you have an idea. Some of it becomes quite rusty, but you do have an idea about how the body works, how side effects of drugs may be important or not important, as the case may be, and what the general outlook of some of these conditions are. So it really gives you that the sort of clinician scientist does bring in an extra dimension. They may not be the brightest person in terms of understanding the small parts of biology that people are looking at, but they can put it into a context. So science very much is a team exercise. And so you bring that flavour in, your colleagues who are absolute experts on the minutiae of genetics or biology or certain aspects of biochemistry or pharmacology will bring in that huge depth. You bring in a bit more breadth, perhaps, in your knowledge.
Interesting. That makes sense. Having that like personal experience with patients kind of gives you a window into the emotional aspect of all of this, not just trying to solve for parts of a puzzle or parts of the detailed puzzle to kind of fit in the biology or the mechanisms related to their cancer. Understand. And just for the audience's sake, and maybe you can help us sort of understand, taking a step back now, like what does it mean to have a rare cancer, and maybe how many rare cancers are there, just for general understanding?
Yes, so we've got a slightly confusing strapline, which is rare cancers are not rare. So about 25% of all cancers are in the rare group, and that's rare defined by the really well-established, otherwise known as old-fashioned, way of diagnosing cancer, which is looking down a microscope. So since Victorian times, people have been looking down a microscope, describing blue cells and pink cells and what they look like, and divided them into categories. And there are about 200 different sorts of rare cancers defined by that, by looking down microscopes. And there's an arbitrary cutoff of less than 6 in 100,000 people have these diseases, each individual one of them. But they all add up because there's 200 different sorts. And in some cases, there are maybe in the UK 3,000 or 4,000 people who have it. But in some cases, maybe 3 people in the whole of Europe and maybe 15 in the whole of the US. So some of them are really vanishingly rare. So that's one group of rare cancers. But as we look at cancer more carefully, we begin to realise that cancers are not all the same, even if they look the same down the microscope. So if you look hard enough at breast cancer and colon cancer, prostate cancer, you'll find there are different subtypes within that, defined by genetics often these days, or by expression of genes. So a lot of people will have heard of HER2 positive breast cancer.
Right.
The cancer itself looks the same down a microscope, but once you use a special antibody stain, you can tell that the cells have got a particular characteristic on the outside of them, which happens to make them more sensitive to particular drugs. So those are rarer subtypes of common cancers. And as we look more and more, we'll probably find that, in a sense, all cancers are rare. So no two cancers are the same. So in a sense, it's an increasing problem that people will have to do those very precise treatments. So
Right.
we're in an age of precision medicine. So we're in an age of targeting very carefully individual cancer types. Now, the advantage of these new medicines is they're generally not so toxic. So the medicines that we use a lot still and have relied on up to now are very crude, a lot of them. They will basically attack cancer cells because they're dividing more quickly, quite commonly. So these are drugs that came out of, for example, the First World War, with understanding of how mustard gas worked, for example. But they can have really profound side effects on the body, as you could imagine, because that is a difference of degree rather than absolute. So some of these new drugs only target cells with a particular abnormality and should leave normal cells entirely alone. But as we find more of those, the more the problem arises of finding patients for trials to make sure that they are actually working. And so that's why rare cancer is an expanding field, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned how, in a way we can sort of view any cancer as being in this rare category idea, because one of the hallmarks of cancer is actually that they evade the immune system, or they change or continue to mutate. And, these cancers over time, they'll mutate in a way that's unlike any other previous person's cancer. At least in my mind, and theoretically, you can correct me if I'm wrong there. I guess my question to you actually now is related to some of the upcoming treatments and treatments that have been in the industry for a while, particularly CAR T, for example, that do treat blood-borne cancers. And I think that's, part of your focus. How are you seeing the landscape of CAR T therapies, and what other therapies or upcoming sort of technologies do you think are really going to enhance the ability for us to treat these cancers?
So there's a lot of justified excitement in the area of sort of immunotherapies generally. So the CAR T is one of those new therapies, perhaps the most spectacularly successful when it works, but also fairly intensive to set up, and therefore rolling it out in large numbers of people is a logistics challenge. But alongside that, there are a number of therapies where, in effect, what the therapy does is to rip off the invisibility cloak, if you like, of a cancer and say to the immune system, hey, this one of us has gone rogue. Because the problem with cancer, unlike bacterial infections where the surfaces of those bacteria are very different from normal cells, the surfaces of many cancer cells is pretty similar to a normal cell. Therefore, the immune system doesn't recognize it. But what these new therapies do is to remove that protection, and they inhibit the way in which those cancer cells evade immunotherapy, immune mechanisms. So that area is now really showing its worth in many cancer areas. So that's one block of excitement, if you like. The other is still the very targeted therapies that go for genetic mutations which are not found in normal cancer cells. And the poster child for that actually came from a disease I studied when I was learning in the lab, which is chronic myeloid leukemia. So when I was a trainee, if you came in with chronic myeloid leukemia, you were often in your 20s and 30s. You'd often just got married and started a family. You were just settling down. You came in, you were very poorly. You could treat that person and the cancer went away for a while, but almost all of those patients relapsed and died at the prime of their life, basically. With the introduction of a drug called imatinib, which only works on chronic myeloid leukemia cells, those leukemias kind of melted away. And now that is the standard treatment for that disease, and it's reduced it to almost a chronic disease. That's not to trivialize the problems that these patients have in terms of side effects, etc., but their survival is dramatically better. So there's still that group of cancers molecularly targeted, molecular targets, immunotargets. And of course, the new kid on the block, post-COVID, is vaccines. So before COVID, there were a few scientists sort of saying, look, messenger RNA directed therapies is the way to go. And people were saying, well, how on earth are we ever going to get those into patients? They'll be frightfully toxic and, it's be horrendous. And there were regulatory barriers were huge. If you want a good example of needs must, then COVID was it. So you had these brand new approach of mRNA vaccines pushed through because of necessity, because the world was under tremendous threat, showed to be safe. So instantly we know we can now do that without growing extra legs and things that people were worried about. And of course, now the cancer people are saying, right, hey, we've got over that thing about it being too toxic to put in people. We know it's not. And they're now targeting cancer targets. So that's the new kid on the block. And it's going to be fascinating to see how that pans out.
Yeah, it will be. Are you feeling positive about mRNA vaccines in terms
I am
of treating
actually.
cancers?
I've always been a bit dubious about bandwagons because they come and they go. And I was a little dubious about the immuno, but that's worked out fine. And I there's a long way to go. Selecting the right targets, overcoming sort of toxicities that we don't know about, I'm sure will happen. It'll be a bumpy road, but I think I am optimistic. Yeah, I'm generally much more optimistic than I was when I was 30 about cancer.
Well, you've seen a lot of the entire oncology landscape evolve over time, not just the treatments, but just the standards of care. I think, the way that we approach cancer patients has changed most likely, especially like in different regions. You've probably been able to experience a little bit of that. One question I was just wondering about regarding the mRNA, are there currently any mRNA vaccine trials for cancer patients that are happening alongside RareCan or RareCan patients by any chance yet?
Not alongside us yet. We'd love to speak to anybody who's trying to set one up. And there's 2 or 3 that are emerging. I've noticed on the website that broadcasts these trials. We haven't managed to engage anybody with us yet, but if there's someone listening and they're trying to recruit into an mRNA trial and they think about opening it in the UK, please get in touch.
Yeah, and I'm sure you're thinking about clinicaltrials.gov, or what's the UK version of that?
No, we all use the same. We use clinicaltrials.gov as our place of registration for trials. Yeah, it's truly international, which is it's one of those great resources, really.
It is one of the things that we can always look back and say, wow, at least that was done well or well enough, and that organization is really improving the website and the access to the data. So in any case, let's put that aside for now. I understand that you have this Bioresource program within RareCan. What does that do, and who does it help?
So if you're trying to understand cancer, you've got to understand kind of 2 things. We've referred to it really already. The first is the patient, how they are, what's their general state of health. Have they got other serious medical conditions which may limit their ability to take part in trials? But you also need to know as much as you possibly can about the cancer. So a certain amount is known by the doctors treating the patients because they will do routine tests. But if you've got a novel drug, they may not have done the relevant tests for that particular drug. So therefore, you need to be able to access tissue from that cancer and do, for example, a genetic screen or an immunotest to characterize it. And to do that, you go back to the hospital where they were treated, and with patient's permission, and in fact instruction, you can obtain some tissue and you can do your own assays on that. Well, the Bioresource is set up within a pretty strict ethical guidelines, so it's supervised in the UK by an oversight body run by the National Health Service to see that it's all set up, the consents, etc. are appropriate. The tissue can be brought into a central place and used for research. And again, that's something that we're very happy to partner with other people who want to do a particular set of investigations. So a bioresource basically is biobanks, as another term for it, is a collection of tissues and blood from patients with cancer.
That's fantastic. And that's definitely one foundational part of building this database of patients so that they are able to find the treatments or trials that might help them. So, and I know it's a lot of work setting that up. Like a biobank is not a simple thing to do. You mentioned like having the consents appropriately in that system, and getting all that information, to the patient appropriately as well, and just making sure everyone is, in compliance with the laws. Not easy, especially as it's
No,
always changing
no,
sometimes.
and it's also one of those things that does vary between countries.
Yes.
Varies over time, varies between countries, and also there are sensitivities around people's particular beliefs in terms how tissues should be treated and respected, and we need to obviously take those into consideration too.
Can you give me an example of that? I'm just wondering, I think, in terms of, there are some religions, people with certain beliefs that restrict them from getting
Yeah,
tested, or is it more just having the sample in the first place?
so some people firmly believe that bodies should be buried intact, and so their spiritual belief would lead them to strongly feel that any part of them that is not present at a burial would make them spiritually incomplete in some way. And it varies across religions. I'm not a religious expert, so I would be very hesitant in sort of giving lots of examples, but certainly, for example, very orthodox Jewish people in the Jewish community do have strong beliefs about these things. They do. Again, it does vary a little bit, but they will on occasions give permission, and sometimes they don't feel able to do so.
Interesting.
And there are other religions with similar sort of feelings, and often it's open to interpretation, I think, as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that part of your experience, dealing with patients, of course, they have certain mindsets of the world, and you can't. That's their right, right? And,
Yeah,
as a doctor, this is not something you're challenging. This is
yeah.
something that you're accepting, of course. So it creates additional sort of dimensions to how you're working with them,
Yeah.
different dimensions to how the clinical trials should be prepared to work with them. So it's very interesting. I think it's
Yeah,
very.
so there's a lot of in the UK. There's a lot of feeling about respect as well. Now it's a little bit strange because the feelings about respect for the body do come from the normal part of the body, not a cancer. So quite a lot of people will sort of say, "What? If I've got cancer, I want you to stamp on it rather than sort of respect it." So it's where the normal part of your body goes into a cancerous part of your body, and it's interesting how people will externalize their cancer and regard it as almost a hostile stranger that's come to visit them, sort of stuff.
Yeah, it's
So,
like it's
so
not part of them, or they
no,
try to.
so
Mhm.
so it's a very, I mean, it's a fascinating kind of spiritual, straight philosophical kind of. I've spent quite a lot of time thinking about biobanks. There's discussions I've had before in some depth.
Sure. Yeah, and I'm imagining, like, uh, cancerous tumors versus bloodborne cancer. There's a lot of differences there too. Like you can physically see a tumor versus in the blood it's less visible. In
Yes.
any case, did you have a comment? Sorry.
No, no, yes. So, I mean, the whole business about patients vary in the way that they regard their cancer is quite interesting. The externalization thing seems quite often something
Yeah,
that's adopted.
and it's part of, like,
But
I mean, like a self-defense mechanism in some
yeah,
ways too. It's like you don't
yeah,
want
yeah.
to.
And then there's a whole debate about whether you should use the military metaphors for treating cancer. Whether you talk about people fighting cancer, if you do that and they lose the fight, is that the appropriate metaphor? Have they not tried hard enough? Which is never the case. So, so the exact words you use around cancer are actually quite important.
No, yeah, you bring up a good point. These are really, you know, these are at the forefront actually of the communication between patients and doctors. I think that we don't really see. I'm from the outside, but like in those offices, it is talked about very often. Changing gears a little bit, I'm just curious about how patients have shared their feedback on this bioresource program, or even just the community itself in RareCan.
So we've had very very positive responses from the people who've engaged with us. Obviously, if they haven't engaged with us, they may not feel so positive about it. But the people who have signed up generally have been incredibly supportive. And on our website, we've got some links to really touching and moving kind of endorsements of our efforts. And it's one of those things that when sometimes running a business is hard and you get dispirited and think you're not going to get through. But a couple of minutes watching one of those videos or talking to a patient, and you think, oh yeah, okay, this is why we're doing this. We're offering realistic hope, I think. So people don't ever want to think there's no possibility of any way of contributing. The other thing that people refer to a lot is this may not be any good for me, but as long as it helps other people who have to go through this to go through it more easily. And people are touching. I mean, I sometimes have to wipe away a tear generally because they are so altruistic. A lot of people, they do think of others. They do think of people to come as well as themselves.
Yeah. Anytime we have to, ponder our own mortality, I feel like it brings us, or it reminds us that we are actually all connected, and maybe we don't understand how yet, but it's very hard to shake away that feeling of connection. When you're feeling it, especially. And then, in those moments of these patients' lives, they're feeling very vulnerable, and again, I can't even speak from experience, so I'm going to just stop there, but because I just want to respect the patients that are experiencing that. So,
I mean, the other thing they experience, I think, is loneliness as well, because if you've got a rare cancer, you go along to the clinic and sit waiting in the waiting room, and nobody else has got that what you've got, so they can't really share that experience in the same way that somebody who did could. So it's building a community really as well, so they can put in touch with somebody who's gone through a similar experience to them.
And this is quite, relatively new thing for us, right? Like just the ability to connect online, just the virtual platforms that have risen. You can even mention RareCan is certainly one, but even tools like Facebook, there's many patient groups there, and there's hundreds of other sort of communities that have been developed in order to help people connect with others that are like them, or similar to them. And this was not the case 30, 40, 50 years ago. People kind of did suffer alone. Yeah.
The internet and AIDS arose about at the same time. And actually, I think it was AIDS that sort of supercharged this business of communicating across boundaries.
What was it? Sorry, I missed it.
So people with the early people with HIV, which I also predate HIV, communicated with each other by this new thing called the internet. And that's how they managed to galvanize themselves into really pressurizing the development of new treatments, and mobilized and become, in effect, one of the most effective political organizations they were within the medical health field. And the example I gave earlier of chronic myeloid leukemia was soon after that, and they did the same. They had managed to mobilize and say, right, go to your doctor, demand this new treatment in a way that had not been seen before. Medical profession were going, whoa, what's going on? We've got patients asking us to do things. They seem to know more about it than we do. What's going on? How's that happened? And that was because of the internet.
I'm sure, yeah. And it's still shifting, right? Our culture around that. What kind of partnerships are you currently seeking?
So the most important partnership is the one with the patients. So the more people we can get to sign up, the more we can fill in the gaps within our portfolio of rare cancer patients. And numbers are power in this area, both statistically and politically, as we've spoken about. So the more people that we bring to our site, the better we'll be. We'll be able to provide more resources. The other call to partnership really is potential clients. So small pharmaceutical companies, large companies, those that are finding it difficult to recruit into trials, we're delighted to hear from them. And we're still at a stage where is there ever a stage when you're not delighted to hear from a potential investor? But
of course,
at the moment, even more delighted than we might be in a few years' time.
Absolutely. And speaking on that, can you share how RareCan is funded?
So RareCan started in the fairly traditional way for a small startup, I think, which is family, friends, and then one or two really visionary and friendly angels descended through personal contact, and had the faith in us to get us to where we are now through the pre-seed stage. We're sort of late seed at the moment, so it's just launching another funding round, which would be able to enable us to develop our services for the patients, to do more in the way of screening for cancers, and then grow rapidly, because we need to increase the number of people that clients can access. and then we can really take off.
Do you know how much you're looking to raise for your next round?
We'd like to look for somewhere between 3 and 5 million UK pounds.
Excellent. How difficult is it to raise money for rare cancer research and development? Given that it is a rare, what's the environment like for raising?
So the investment environment at the moment is probably very difficult. I mean, it is very difficult. And it's probably as difficult as has been since 2008, I would guess. That's what our investors are saying. And part of the problem is that investors have an option now because they can get a bit of interest on their money. So we have a fair degree of political instability in the Western world, I'd say, without being too contentious. As certainly in Europe's unstable place at the moment. So investors are cautious quite often and they'll sit on their hands a bit. So people in the past who would have been less cautious are now sort of saying, well, I'm going to sit around for a while, sit this one out. So it is tough at the moment. One option we are looking at is strategic investors, so potentially companies who may be interested in us as clients to start off with, and then potentially as service providers and maybe, of course, part of their companies eventually. So that's a strategy we're pursuing pretty actively.
That makes sense. What are some of RareCan's goals for the remainder of 2023 and into 2024?
So one of our goals we've already talked about, which is our investment round. That's an important part of what we're doing. We're going to launch an exciting new program to genetically characterize as many cancers as we can of the numbers we have, and that will enrich the data set we have. And we're also looking to reach out into other countries, probably Australia to start off with, but I'd be very keen to talk to people who could help us in the US, because frankly, the US is where most of the innovation is occurring within drug development. That's where most of the major pharmaceutical companies are based. And so, we would love to have a partner there who could guide us in that process.
Excellent. And I really hope some of the clients potentially out there listening, or even patients listening today, would check out RareCan, check out the website. It's listed in the show notes and description. So finally, I just want to thank you again, Andy, for joining me today and speaking to me about RareCan and your experience as a physician as well, and just sort of briefly just touching on the surface of how cancer patients must feel throughout this process of finding a clinical trial. So again, thank you so much. Is there anything else you want to share with the audience before we conclude?
No, it's been fascinating to talk to you, and it's a really exciting time. So I look forward to hearing from some of your viewers and having a further conversation.
Excellent. And if you've enjoyed this, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to, have others be able to view and listen to this. So any support you give will really help us. So thank you.